When legal called him, he went pale. Did you know she holds signing authority on 28 deals? 3 hours earlier, Connor Vale had walked into my office without knocking. I was halfway through reviewing a polymer efficiency report, red pen in hand, when his reflection appeared on the glass wall behind me, impatient, self-satisfied, new suit still crisp from the tailor. He'd been CEO for 16 days. Dr. Ellison, he said. Voice clipped. We need to talk about your compensation. I set my pen down. The report between us might as well have vanished. He slid a printed spreadsheet across my desk, one yellow cell glowing under the fluorescent light. My name. My salary. The line he clearly believed was a mistake. You're overpaid, he said, almost laughing. It's not personal. We're just aligning pay to market standards. He didn't look at me as he spoke. He looked at the number, the digits he planned to erase. I'd spent 15 years at Avarice Engineering, long enough to recognize the tone of someone who thought engineers were interchangeable. He kept talking about efficiency, about optics. I heard only fragments. My coffee had gone cold, and the hum of the ventilation system filled the silence between his words. When he finally said, "Effective immediately. Your new rate is 60% of this." Something inside me tightened but didn't break. Of course, I said quietly. I'll need to review the documentation before I sign anything. Legal reports, to me now. He replied, smiling as he turned toward the door. Nothing to review. When the door closed, I let the silence expand until the sound of my own breathing steadied. Then I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a slim, faded folder labeled Section 7C. I hadn't touched it in years, but the paper inside still smelled faintly of toner and ink. If anyone had asked me then what I was doing, I'd have said I was just being thorough. But as I reread the clause I'd negotiated nearly a decade ago, I realized foresight wasn't paranoia. It was survival. By sunset, he'd understand that too. The folder was thin, but it carried the weight of every year I had spent building this company. The label Section 7C was written in my own hand. The ink faded to a soft gray. I unfolded the first page, tracing the corner with my thumb as the memory came back. It was 12 years earlier. The summer Boston baked under a record drought. Avarice Engineering was still small, then 30 people sharing 2 floors in an old brick warehouse by the harbor. We were desperate for a breakthrough. Water restrictions were crippling municipalities across the Northeast, and our investors were threatening to pull out. I had been the only materials scientist on staff when I found the right polymer matrix, one that filtered brine into potable water at a fraction of the usual cost. It felt less like discovery and more like rescue. The prototype had saved the company. Within a year, every filtration unit Avarice sold carried my name in the patent filings. That was when Margaret Heller stepped in. She was our outside counsel at the time, a retired patent attorney with a voice like gravel and the patience of a saint. One evening, she handed me a draft contract across a diner table and said, "If they ever try to cut your pay, make sure they buy the roof you built over their heads." That clause became Section 7C Change of Control and Compensation Protection. It tied my compensation directly to the revenue generated by my patents. Any reduction over 15% triggered a buyout at 8 times annual licensing value. Back then, it seemed like overkill. Margaret had just smiled. "Someday," she said, "someone will forget what you're worth. Paper will remind them." Now, sitting under the same sterile office lights I'd worked beneath for 15 years, I reread every line. The clause hadn't expired. The board had never amended it. Connor's impulsive efficiency adjustment wasn't just short-sighted. It was catastrophic. I closed the folder carefully, aligning its edges with the desk, then opened my email. It was time to remind legal exactly what Section 7C meant and who still owned the foundation of Avarice Engineering. I typed the email slowly, attaching the relevant pages of my employment contract, Section 7C, subsection C, and sent it to Janet Rowe, the company's general counsel. I'd worked with Janet for years, long before Avarice grew into the polished corporate tower it occupied now. She was methodical, quiet, and allergic to panic. If anyone could cut through Connor Vale's noise, it was her. My phone rang less than 10 minutes later. "Mara," she said, voice tight but steady. "I just opened your email. Did Connor actually implement the reduction already?" "He told me it's effective immediately," I replied. There was a pause long enough for me to hear papers shifting, the muted clatter of her keyboard, then a sharp inhale. "He cut you by 40%. That exceeds the 15% threshold by a mile." "I'm aware," I said. "Do you realize what that triggers I do?" Another silence, this one heavier. Then the buyout clause, calculated at 8 times licensing revenue. "Mara, your patents brought in over $2.5 million per quarter last fiscal year, $20.3 million, I said, rounded. When Janet spoke again, her voice had changed. "Did he review your original employment file before approving this? No. He told me legal reports to him now." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Not today. It doesn't." I could picture her already, glasses pushed to the edge of her nose, color draining from her face as she scrolled through the documents. "This is bad," she muttered. "For him, not for you." "Then we should act quickly," I said. "Don't respond to him. Don't acknowledge any HR forms. Leave everything as is. I'll brief the board before he realizes what he's done." When the call ended, I leaned back, exhaling slowly. Outside my office window, Boston's skyline glimmered under the pale winter sun. Somewhere, in one of those mirrored buildings, Connor Vale was still congratulating himself on saving a few $100,000. He didn't yet understand that, in the language of contracts, a careless signature could cost $20 million, and silence could sound a lot like strategy. By the time I arrived on the 22nd floor, the glass conference room was already half full. The city stretched beyond the windows, gray and frozen under the late afternoon light. A carafe of untouched coffee sat between neatly folded nameplates, evidence of a meeting called in a hurry. Janet sat near the end of the long table, her expression neutral, but her posture sharp. To her left was Richard Hale, the CFO, tapping numbers into a tablet. Connor Vale stood at the head of the table, his jacket off, sleeves rolled up like he'd been dragged into something beneath him. "Let's get this over with," he said when I stepped inside. His tone carried that familiar mix of authority and impatience. Richard cleared his throat. "We've run the numbers. If Section 7C is active, and it appears it is, the total exposure is approximately $21.4 million, based on last year's licensing revenue." Connor laughed, short and brittle. "That's absurd. She can't possibly own the entire product line." Janet turned a page in the file. 23 active patents, she said quietly. "All filed under Dr. Ellison's authorship, and still licensed under her original agreements. The revenue basis is clear." The room went very still. Someone from the board, a man I'd never met, shifted uncomfortably. Adjusting his tie, Connor's voice rose. "You're telling me we're hostage to a technicality she wrote 12 years ago?" Janet didn't look up. "To an agreement your predecessor signed. One that's legally binding." The air seemed to thicken. Even the hum of the projector faded. Connor's jaw worked soundlessly, and for the first time since I'd met him, he didn't have anything to say. Richard exhaled and leaned back, his voice measured. "We have 2 options: restore her compensation immediately, or trigger the buyout clause. Either way, we pay." No one moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock and the whisper of my own breathing. I folded my hands on the table, calm and steady. Let them calculate. Let them realize. For once, silence belonged to me. That night, Boston was quiet beneath a thin veil of snow. I left the office long after the others, the city lights turning the sidewalks into mirrors. My phone vibrated as I turned onto Beacon Street, an unfamiliar number from Chicago. Dr. Ellison, a man's voice said, smooth and confident. This is Michael Torres from Helix Water Systems. I hope I'm not calling too late. He wasn't calling at all by accident. We've followed your work for years, he continued. Especially the Ellison membrane. Impressive output. If you're considering changes at Avarice, Helix would be honored to acquire your patent portfolio. I stopped beneath a street lamp, the cold seeping through my gloves. You're offering to buy my patents? Yes, he said. Outright, $25 million, plus a research division under your direction. You'd have full autonomy, no more internal politics. It was an enticing number. But there was something rehearsed in his tone, as if he already knew about Connor's attempt to cut my pay. How did you get my number? I asked. He hesitated just long enough to confirm my suspicion. A mutual contact. I understand you might be reconsidering your position. I'm not, I said and hung up before he could say more. The city air burned sharp in my lungs. I stood there, pulse steady, but my thoughts ran fast. There were only a handful of people who knew about Section 7C, and only one who had reason to leak it. By morning, Janet confirmed it. She found a disclosure form Connor had filed months ago when he joined the company's small print, easily overlooked. A consulting stake in Helix Water Systems. Not illegal, but revealing. In the glow of my computer screen, the truth felt cold and clinical. He hadn't just underestimated me. He'd been setting the stage to push me out to strip my name from the work I had built and sell it to someone waiting on the other end of the phone. The humiliation from that morning hardened into something quieter, sharper. Betrayal no longer surprised me. It clarified everything. By the next morning, Janet's tone over the phone was no longer cautious, it was surgical. We found it, she said. Internal emails. Connor's been corresponding with Helix for weeks. I closed my office door, the soft click echoing louder than it should have. How far back? Before your pay adjustment, she replied. He sent them summaries of your royalty contracts. Internal revenue projections enough for Helix to value your patents before they even called you. I didn't say anything. The silence on the line stretched. Heavy but clean, Janet continued, her voice tightening. He was coordinating a scenario where you'd walk out, triggering the buyout or selling directly to them. If Helix acquired your technology, his consulting shares would skyrocket. We traced it through his private Gmail. He didn't even bother to use the corporate system. The edges of my vision blurred slightly, not from shock, but from the strange, steady calm that follows confirmation. He had planned everything: the insult, the salary cut, the humiliation. He wanted me to leave angry. He'd built a trap and stepped into it himself. By noon, the board had called an emergency meeting. I didn't attend, but I watched from the glass hallway as security led Connor Vale through the lobby. His tie hung loose, his expression was flat and gray. He didn't fight it. The man who once walked into my office uninvited now had nowhere left to stand. When the elevator doors closed behind him, Janet appeared beside me. Terminated for cause, she said quietly. He'll face an ethics inquiry, possibly legal action. I nodded. And Helix, they'll go dark for a while. We've already informed outside counsel. We stood there for a moment, watching the elevator's digital numbers blink down to 0. Somewhere below, he would step out into the same cold wind that had followed me home the night before. Justice came fast, too fast to feel clean. The satisfaction was muted, almost weightless. What stayed was the image of that morning, his laugh, the spreadsheet sliding across my desk, and the quiet knowledge that numbers, once written, always speak back. By late afternoon, the boardroom door opened again, this time without tension, just exhaustion. Janet motioned for me to come in. Richard Hale, the CFO, looked older than he had yesterday. Dr. Ellison, he said, we've reviewed every scenario. You have 2 options. He slid 2 envelopes across the table. Option 1, accept the buyout, $20 million, full patent transfer. Option 2, stay on, with full restoration of compensation and a performance bonus. No penalty. No record. I looked at the envelopes but didn't touch them. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of everything I'd built. "Take the night," Richard said. "No pressure. You've earned the right to decide what this place means to you." That evening, I walked along the Boston Harbor. The air was sharp, the water steel gray under the sodium lights. My reflection followed beside me, rippling with every gust of wind. 15 years of my life had passed in laboratories and conference rooms, prototypes, failed tests, long nights of data analysis. I thought of my team, young engineers who still believed that good work was its own reward. I thought of the drought years, when the first version of my membrane had pulled clean water out of poisoned soil. 20 million could buy silence. It could buy peace, even freedom. But it couldn't buy what I saw in their faces when a prototype finally worked, the awe, the belief that what we did mattered. I stopped by the railing, gloved hands resting on the cold metal. Somewhere downtown, Connor Vale was probably drafting statements, his story already being rewritten, but mine wasn't finished. When I finally turned back toward the city, the decision was already made. The buyout would have been an ending. What I wanted was continuity. In the quiet rhythm of the harbor, I found something steadier than victory, something that sounded like purpose. Tomorrow, I would walk back into that building and claim what was mine. Not just the money, but the work itself. The next morning, the city was still half asleep when I arrived at Avarice. Frost clung to the windows, and the air smelled faintly of salt from the harbor. Inside, the building felt different, quiet, stripped of its usual edge. People looked up when I walked through the lobby, not out of curiosity, but acknowledgement. News travels fast when the ground shifts overnight. Richard was already waiting in the boardroom, a mug of untouched coffee beside him. Janet sat across from him, flipping through a printed draft. The atmosphere was calm, but alert, the kind of quiet before something permanent takes shape. "Dr. Ellison," Richard began, gesturing for me to sit. "We'd like to finalize the terms. I'd like to adjust them first," I said. Janet arched a brow but didn't interrupt. I slid a page across the table. "Full restoration of salary plus 20%, I said. "An updated clause giving me veto rights on any third-party licensing that restricts water access in developing countries. And a mentorship fund, $50,000 annually for junior engineers. I'll oversee it directly." Richard studied the page. "You want veto power. I want responsibility," I said. "The technology was meant to make water cleaner, not costlier." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Janet leaned back, a small smile tugging at her mouth. "You didn't just protect yourself, Mara. You changed the framework." Richard exhaled, signing the page. "Done. I'll have legal integrate it today." As I signed the final line, the pen felt steady in my hand, no tremor, no hesitation. The contract would outlive this morning, and maybe even me. It wasn't just protection anymore. It was principle set in ink. Janet gathered the papers, her voice softer now. "You didn't just win," she said. "You rewrote the system." Outside, the harbor light broke through the clouds, bright and unfiltered. The reflection shimmered across the conference table, touching the documents between us. It looked almost like movement, a ripple traveling outward, steady and unstoppable. 3 weeks later, the company moved on without ceremony. Connor's name disappeared from the directory. His office emptied overnight. There was no announcement, just a short email from Human Resources thanking him for his service during a period of transition. By the time the message reached the staff, no one even looked up from their screens. For the first time in months, Avarice felt weightless again. The boardroom battles faded into memory. The work returned to its natural rhythm. I spent my mornings in the lab, where the hum of compressors blended with the soft drip of distilled water and the faint, comforting scent of coffee grounds. Leah, my doctoral mentee, arrived early that Thursday, balancing 2 mugs and a folder of results. Flow rates improved another 7%, she said, sliding the paper toward me. Her hair was still damp from the rain, her eyes bright with that same eager curiosity I remembered from my own first years here. I scanned the data, tracing the curve of the new membrane performance graph. It's holding at higher pressure, I said. That's a good sign. The polymer alignment's stable this time. She grinned. I think we finally cracked it. The lab lights reflected off the surface of the water test unit, a slow, steady stream moving through the membrane, clear as glass. Outside, the morning fog over the harbor began to lift, revealing the city skyline. Leah leaned against the counter. Can I ask something? Of course. When everything happened with Connor, weren't you angry? I looked up from the chart. Angry. Yes. But not surprised. People like him see only the cost column. They never see the equation that built it. She nodded, thoughtful, and returned to her workstation. As I watched her adjust the valves, I realized that the hum, the steady rhythm of testing, the quiet persistence was the real reward. The contract, the numbers, the signatures they were scaffolding. The structure was here, in the work that continued, outside the window. The sun broke through the last layer of fog, catching the ripples on the harbor water. The light spilled across the lab bench, bright and even, and I let it fill the room in silence. The city was quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that arrives only when winter and dusk meet halfway. From my balcony, the Charles River shimmered under the lights of the Longfellow Bridge, each ripple catching a trace of gold before fading into dark. I sat with a blanket around my shoulders, a cup of tea cooling beside me, and the newest patent draft open on my laptop. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the page, waiting for one last sentence. I had read it 3 times already, checking for the kind of precision that outlasts memory. A clause here, a decimal there each line, another layer of protection, quiet and deliberate. Somewhere behind me, the hum of the apartment heater filled the silence. It was the same kind of hum that had followed me through years of late nights at the lab. I thought about that morning Connor's voice, the spreadsheet sliding across my desk, his laugh. For a long time, that sound had followed me everywhere. A small echo of arrogance I couldn't quite shake. But now it barely registered, just background noise fading into distance. I saved the file and leaned back, across the river. The lights from Kendall Square reflected against the water, sharp and symmetrical. The skyline looked the same as it always had, but something underneath it had shifted, like the ground had finally recognized who built the foundation beneath it. In the glass door's reflection, I caught a glimpse of myself, older, steadier, but still the woman who had written Section 7C when no one thought she'd need it. I smiled, faintly. He had laughed because he didn't read the files. I survived because I wrote them. The river kept moving, slow and certain, carrying the light downstream. I closed my laptop, finished the tea, and let the last of the cold air settle against my face. The day had ended without ceremony, but that felt right. Some victories didn't need applause. They only needed quiet, the kind earned through patience, precision, and the calm certainty that the work, like the river, would always continue.